This is the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro, Lethal Gaming Gear's second most controlled pad in their lineup, and one that's taken the TAC FPS world by storm, being the pad of choice for many Valorant and Counter-Strike pros. Over my time reviewing, I've reviewed so many control-focused mouse pads they've all kind of started to look and feel the same, but the Saturn Pro is a notable exception as while this pad is very controlled-focused, it performs very uniquely. And just like we've seen with all of Lethal's other pads, the Saturn Pro is extremely high quality and the pad feels very premium. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to take a deep dive and talk all about the pros and cons of the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro. But before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you to Tekusai, who was kind enough to give me his copy of the Saturn Pro. I've been trying to get my hands on this pad for quite a while and I haven't been able to do so until now, so thank you very much to Tekusai for giving me his copy. And if you enjoyed the review and want to see reviews of Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads like the upcoming Hyperion, which is Lethal Gaming Gear's collab with Pulsar, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. In terms of testing parameters, I have the firm-based version of the Saturn Pro here. I tested the pad for approximately 3 weeks using the pad for both work and gaming, and I used a bunch of different skates over my testing with the pad, but I settled on using the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox skates, and for sensitivity range I played around 40 to 50 cm per 360. In terms of versions, there is a Pro and non-Pro version of the Saturn. Both versions have the same surfacing type and are available in both black and red colorways, but the non-Pro only comes in one firmness option, while the Pro version has 3 firmness options: extra soft, soft, and firm, the one I'll be covering today. In terms of sizing, the Saturn Pro lineup comes in a bunch of different sizes. There is a 490 by 420mm, a 500 by 500mm, and a 1000 by 500mm. All these versions are 4mm thick, and the version I'll be covering today is the 490 by 420 by 4mm version. In terms of in-game performance, seeing as the Saturn Pro is at its core a control-focused pad, you would expect it to have a very control-focused performance profile. But since I have the firm-based version of this pad, and because there isn't any softness to the surfacing to increase the pad's natural control, this version of the pad is the fastest version available. As such, instead of a controlled focus performance profile as you'd expect a controlled pad to have, the firm-based version of the Saturn Pro has more of a balanced control performance profile. This causes the Saturn Pro firm to feel surprisingly well-rounded in terms of its performance, as expected for a pad with a balanced controlled performance profile, being well-suited for both static and flicking aiming, but also dynamic and tracking aiming. Admittedly, the tracking performance was very controlled, a little more than I personally prefer. This is why I use the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox skates, as they help to speed up the pad's controlled optimized surfacing, which made tracking and dynamic aiming feel a little less restricted by the pad's surface. But even with speed optimized skates, the pad's static and flicking performance was still absolutely stellar. So from my testing, the firm-based variant of the Saturn Pro is not only great for TAC FPS games, it's also amazing for static-oriented characters in more dynamic aiming games like Cassidy, Ashe, Widowmaker, and Illari in Overwatch 2, as well of course also being good for some tracking characters in some situations, but again it is a little more on the controlled side. But if you get the extra soft or soft-based variants of the Saturn Pro, these pads will perform much more akin to the other softer controlled focus pads we've covered on the channel before, such as the Zowie GSR2 or the Infinity Mice Control V2, as the added softness from the softer base will make the pad feel much more controlled, reducing its usability for more tracking and dynamic performance, but increasing its static and flicking performance. In terms of build quality and QC, even though my copy is secondhand and has been used quite a bit, the pad has actually held up incredibly well. All the pad stitching is consistent and there aren't any dead zones or any issue areas I found over my testing. The base is very well implemented and performs great. Again, even though this pad has already been used for quite a while, the base is still held up quite well. The edge stitching is also held up incredibly well with no fraying or loose stitching anywhere on the pad's edge stitching. But I did want to make a quick note that if you do purchase a brand new Saturn, just like the Neptune, the pad will likely have a very strong plastic or chemically smell from the pad's die and base out of the box. Now this will dissipate over time, and since my unit is secondhand I didn't have this issue, but if you do buy a brand new Saturn, I would highly recommend airing the pad out outside for a couple hours before you use it, just to dissipate as much of the smell as possible. Next, let's talk about the Saturn Pro's surfacing. Just like the lethal gaming gear Neptune, the Saturn Pro's surface stitching is made out of polyester. Under the microscope, we can see that the surface stitching is a linear bidirectional zigzag stitching that runs up the pad's y-axis. The stitching is very similar to the surface stitching we saw in the Zowie GSR2, but the Saturn Pro's surface stitching is slightly tighter and the threading is just ever so slightly thicker. The surface stitching, despite its unique shape and linearity, does feel decently balanced with no significant variation in the X and Y axes, but this is mainly due to the firm base version I have here today. On the extra soft and soft base versions, there will be more of a variance in the X and Y axis, with more friction on the X axis and less on the Y axis, the same as it was on the GSR2. The surfacing gives the Saturn Pro some very unique friction coefficients, as expected given its unique performance that I spoke about earlier, as the pad's initial and braking frictions are faster than you'd find on other controlled focus pads, but the dynamic friction is much higher, being equal or slightly heavier than what you'd find on other control pads, but not to a degree where movements feel muddy per se, meaning that the pad, as I mentioned earlier, has more of a balanced control performance profile that's usable for not only static and flicking aiming but also dynamic and tracking aiming. The pad's performance profile will of course change on the other base versions, as those pads will have a higher level of initial dynamic and braking frictions across the board, which gives those versions a more controlled focused performance profile, as they'll have that muddy controlled feeling to them. But keep in mind that this is based off my experience using dots and donut skates over my testing. If you use other skates, shapes, sizes, or materials, the friction coefficients of the pad will be slightly altered. I also wanted to quickly touch on control variability. Since the firm base version I have here today doesn't have any real usable softness to it, there is no range of control variability on the firm base version of the Saturn Pro, but on the soft and extra soft base versions there will of course be more softness to it, so they will have a higher range of control, which will make the pads feel much more controlled as I just mentioned earlier. But here on the firm base version of the Saturn Pro there isn't any range of control variability to speak of. Next up, let's talk about skate compatibility. Now generally speaking, control focus pads tend to have pretty poor skate compatibility, as they're usually quite soft, so you can't use smaller surface area skates like dots or speed stock skates on them. But since I have the firm base variant of the Saturn Pro here, the pad skate compatibility is much better from what you'd see on a more traditional control pad. As I mentioned earlier, I tested a wide variety of skates here on my Saturn Pro firm over my testing, and I found that dots, donuts, smaller surface area stock skates, full-size stock skates, and everything else under the sun was fully compatible here with the Saturn Pro, and over my testing I didn't have any kind of issues in regards to skate compatibility here with this version. But I did want to note that very control focused skates like the TGX Exact skates and the Ghost Glides Vortex skates, which have highly controlled performance profiles, are a little too slow in combination with the Saturn's very controlled surfacing, at least in my opinion. Still completely usable by all means, just a little too controlled for my tastes. As I mentioned earlier, I much more preferred more speed-focused skates like the Unusual Way Sports Silver Fox skates for use here on the Saturn Pro, but all skate shapes, types, and materials were fully compatible here with the Saturn Pro firm variants. But keep in mind that this only applies to the firm base version of the Saturn Pro. This does not apply to the extra soft and soft base versions, as just like other control focus pads I've covered here on the channel before, due to their softness, smaller surface area skates like dot skates and smaller surface area stock skates will not be compatible with the pad, as they can't counteract the depth of the pad, meaning that your mouse will bottom out. So on the extra soft and soft base versions of the Saturn Pro, you will need to stick with full-size stock skates or donut skates, as they'll be the most compatible with those base types. Now the non-pro Saturns have a base similar to the foam base we saw in the non-pro and lethal gaming gear Neptune, while the pro version's base is made out of Slim Flex, which is formerly Poron, which not only significantly improves the base's anchoring, it also allows the Pro version to come in the different firmness options as I mentioned earlier. The pad's base is a flat, non-textured base, and since it's made of Slim Flex, the base does have a bit of natural stickiness as expected, which gives the base a strong natural adhesion. The base reminds me a lot of the base we saw in the X-Ray Pad Origins Pro Cerberus, as it has the same natural stickiness just without that hexagonal texturing. The pad will naturally anchor itself to desktops when weight is applied to it, and you can easily fully anchor the pad by pressing down on the pad's surface, the same same process we used for anchoring the Coruscant Samurai. You can also use water to further increase the base's anchoring strength, as Slim Flex Poron does get stickier when it's exposed to moisture, but from my testing I didn't find this necessary at all, as the base's natural stickiness was strong enough to fully anchor the pad, and over my testing I didn't have any issues with the base shifting during use, even with my arm fully resting against the pad. But while the Saturn Pro's base does perform significantly better than the foam base we found on the non-Pro versions, due to its natural stickiness, it does pick up dust, pet fur, and debris constantly, but since the base doesn't have any texturing, it's pretty easy to clean the base off with a finger or just a damp microfiber cloth. Now before I move on, I wanted to make a quick note. The full flat base is only on the firm version of the Saturn Pro. The extra soft and soft versions of this pad will have the textured bases we've seen on Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads. Now before we move on, I wanted to quickly talk edge stitching as well. Just like we've seen on the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune and Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads, the Saturn Pro has the same rounded edge stitch that sits roughly even with the surface of the pad, being approximately 4mm thick. The edge stitching is made out of the same polyester material as the surface stitching, and because of its roundness, it's very easy to run your arm across and up and down the edge stitching without causing any additional friction, both with bare arms and arm sleeves. Another very interesting trait to this Saturn Pro is how it interacts with moisture. Similar to what we saw in the Zowie GSR2, any moisture that makes contact with the pad surface is instantaneously drained into the pad. I've only seen a few pads come even remotely close to the GSR2's level of moisture absorption over my time reviewing, but the Saturn Pro's level of absorption is arguably on par or better than the GSR2's, which is very impressive. But while the pad has amazing absorption, the polyester surface stitching does get affected by moisture, as any wet areas do slow down significantly. Now this only happens if the surface gets exposed to a ton of moisture, more than it'd ever be exposed to during normal use, but if you have a very sweaty arm or hand and if you happen to soak a small region of the surface, it will create a bit of a slow spot, but even with my very sweaty hands, I never had any issues with this, so I doubt this is going to be the issue area for anyone, but I wanted to mention this regardless. The Saturn Pro surface is also largely immune to humidity, so even in a very high humidity environment and even combined with a super sweaty arm and hand, the pad's performance is going to remain largely unaffected. And in terms of arm sleeve and bare arm usage, since the pad surface has a very minimal amount of texturing from it, from my experience the pad is fully usable with both bare arms and arm sleeves, but some arm sleeve material might be higher friction than others. For example, I found that the Skypad sleeve was a little higher friction than the Focus sleeve, so keep that in mind, but this is common on more control focused pads, and while this doesn't massively impact the pad's usage, be sure to keep this in mind if you're going to get an arm sleeve for usage here on the Saturn Pro. Alright, well in closing, overall I'm quite impressed with the Saturn Pro. I definitely see the merits of this pad as its performance and quality are superb, but even though I have the fastest version of this pad, it's just a little too slow for me as I play a lot of tracking heavy games, and pads like the Lethal Gaming Gear Neptune are just better suited for that use case. But the pad's static performance is in a league of its own in my opinion, and I honestly can't remember the last time I enjoyed using a control pad this much, and I can absolutely see why this pad is the pad of choice for many casual attack FPS players and pros, as it does perform exceptionally well in that aim type. So if you're in the market for a great quality control pad that has fantastic static performance, I'd highly recommend checking out the Saturn lineup, as there's some awesome pads. And Lethal Gaming Gear does make a wide range of pads, such as the Neptune, which I just mentioned, which is a more speed optimized pad, the Jupiter, which is an even more controlled focus pad than the Saturn lineup, as well as a bunch of other pad types. So even if the Saturn isn't necessarily for you, I'd still recommend checking out their other pads, as every single pad I've covered from Lethal Gaming Gear has been absolutely fantastic in both performance and quality, so I'd highly recommend checking out their whole lineup. I also wanted to mention they do also have the Hyperion releasing very soon, which is a collaborative effort between Lethal Gaming Gear and Pulsar, which is a very interesting concept. I actually got my hands on the pad a couple days ago, and it's very unique and it performs quite good as well. So if you want to see a review of the Hyperion and of course Lethal Gaming Gear's other pads, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. Alright, well that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching. Big thank you again to TechUsai for giving me his copy of the Saturn Pro. I greatly appreciate it. Again, I've been trying to get my hands on this pad for a very long time, so thank you very much to him for making this review possible. Thank you very much to our channel members, UKI89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunaris. I greatly appreciate your ongoing support. Our channel members make what I do here on the channel possible with the Teardown Project and the in-depth reviews, so thank you very much for all your continued support. If you'd like to support what I do here on the channel with of course the in-depth reviews and the teardown project. You can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month, or you can use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, TJ Exclusives, and Mech Keys, as well as a couple other retailers to save yourself some money off your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks for watching my review of the Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn Pro, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review.